The wind was a low whisper through the dry grass, carrying the scent of earth baked hard by the sun. It sifted over the broken fence posts and the scattered bones of forgotten livestock, as if trying to remember what once was. In the shade of a lone juniper, a woman moved with deliberate silence, her fingers resting lightly on the swell of her belly beneath the faded calico dress. She did not look back, though the cracked homestead lay not far behind her, its crooked windows like watching eyes. The sky, a pale wash of late afternoon, held the promise of night and the cold that would come with it. She had no name for the fear twisting low in her chest, only a steady pulse of resolve. The land was endless, but she would cross it if she had to. For what was growing inside her was more than hope. It was the fragile promise of life unclaimed by those who would see her broken. Her boots pressed down on cracked earth, soft dust rising at each step. She had left behind a life that clung to her like a shadow, whispers of harsh hands, bitter words, and the hollow ache of loneliness in a house that never felt like home. The child she carried was the one thing they could never touch, never take. It was hers in the deepest sense, more real than the whispered threats, more alive than the cold walls of that place. The first night found her beneath a sky thick with stars, the air crisp and biting. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her, listening to the distant howl of coyotes that carried like a warning. Her breath caught not from the cold, but from the weight of what was to come. There was no turning back now, no room for weakness. She settled beside a creek, its water dark and clear. The moon cast silver shadows over her face, revealing the sharp line of her jaw, the set of her eyes, steady, unyielding. In the stillness, she pressed her hand to her belly and whispered a promise she did not fully understand yet. "I will keep you safe, no matter what." That night, she dreamt of a colt, wild and free, racing across the open plains. The colt carried the same restless fire she felt in her own veins. It was a symbol she clung to, a secret talisman against despair. When dawn spilled gold over the horizon, she was already on her feet, moving forward. The land stretched out before her, full of dangers she had never known but had long imagined. Hunger gnawed at her, and the weight of the baby pressed heavy, but her pace did not falter. Days passed in a blur of sun and sand, of empty waterholes and wary eyes watching from the brush. She learned to read the land with sharp instinct, where the wind shifted, where the earth held moisture, where the trees offered shelter. The colt from her dream lived in her mind like a ghost, urging her onward. In a small, forgotten town, she found work in a dusty saloon, peeling potatoes and sweeping floors for a few coins and a place to rest. The men there looked at her with suspicion, but she met their gazes with a quiet steel. Her belly was visible now, the child growing with every passing day. One evening, the saloon doors swung open with a sudden bang, and a stranger stepped inside, a man with a worn hat pulled low, a tired kindness in his eyes. He saw her not as a thing to be used or dismissed, but as a person bearing a heavy burden. He did not speak much, but his presence was a balm to the harshness surrounding her. It was in that moment, beneath flickering gaslights and the murmurs of the town, that she made a decision. She would not be a shadow any longer. When the child came, she would return, not as a woman broken by fear, but as one armed with all the fierce love and quiet strength she had gathered on the road. The colt would come with her, too, not just in dreams, but in steel and fire, a Colt revolver strapped to her hip, a silent promise that she would protect what was hers. The woman who had run out with a baby in her belly would return, and no one would mistake her for anything less than a force born of survival and mercy. The story was only just beginning. The nights in that town smelled of whiskey and smoke, the kind of smell that clings to clothes and skin and makes a person feel like they carry a burden no one else sees. She worked hard, her hands calloused from scrubbing floors and chopping wood, her back bent beneath the weight of the coming child. The men passed her with wary glances, some curious, others indifferent. She said little, spoke only when needed, and learned the rhythm of quiet endurance. There was a small room above the stables where she rested. It smelled of hay and earth and something faintly sweet, like hope, or maybe just the way the morning light found its way through the cracked window panes. She would sit there sometimes, her hands resting gently on her belly, listening to the horses breathe in the stalls below. The stranger who had come into the saloon stayed nearby, a presence neither intrusive nor distant. He didn't ask questions he didn't need to, and he gave her space without turning away. He was called Judd, and there was a heaviness in his eyes that matched the quiet weight she carried. Sometimes he brought water or food without a word, setting it down gently by the door before slipping away again. One evening, when the sun was a blood-red slash beneath the horizon, Judd sat beside her on the worn steps outside the saloon. The wind teased strands of her hair loose from her braid, and she felt the tension she hadn't allowed herself to name settle like a stone in her chest. "Got a name for the boy?" Judd asked, voice low and steady, like the earth beneath their feet. She looked at him, surprised by the softness there. "Not yet," she said, voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if it's a boy." Judd nodded, not pressing. Names come when they're ready. That night, as the stars bloomed cold and distant overhead, she dreamed again, this time of the colt running hard across a ridge, wild and unbroken, but with a steady hand reaching out to steady it. The image burned in her mind like a promise she was beginning to understand. The days grew hotter, the land more merciless. One afternoon, a storm rolled in, dark clouds swallowing the sun and drumming rain against the tin roofs. She felt the first sharp pains, like fire and ice tangled deep inside. The baby was coming. Judd found her in the stable loft, clutching the rough wooden beams, her face pale but set with a fierce determination. He knelt beside her without hesitation, hands steady as the storm raged outside. The hours stretched thin, marked only by her breath and the relentless pounding of rain. When the cry finally cut through the night, it was small and fierce, a sound that broke the weight of everything that had come before. She held the child close, skin slick and wet, eyes wide and searching. The world shifted beneath her in that moment, the broken pieces finding a kind of shape. Judd watched quietly, the lines around his eyes softening with something like hope. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the earth washed clean and the air sharp and new. She wrapped the baby in a faded quilt, her fingers trembling as she fastened a worn leather holster to her waist. Inside, the cold steel of the Colt rested heavy against her side. The path ahead was still uncertain. The town was no sanctuary. There were eyes that judged and hands that would not hesitate. But she had learned something in the storm's wake. Strength is not just in running, but in standing, in claiming what is yours with quiet fire. She stepped outside, the baby cradled against her chest, and looked toward the horizon. The wind whispered again, carrying the scent of dust and rain and something unspoken. Whatever came next, she would meet it not as a woman fleeing, but as one who had returned. The Colt was there, too, ready, steady, and hers. The sun rose pale and thin over the town, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the wooden planks and dirt streets. She moved through the early morning quiet with the child swaddled close, its tiny breath a steady rhythm against her heart. The Colt rested against her hip, familiar and heavy, a weight that grounded her as much as it guarded. The town held its breath when she walked in, the whispers and sidelong glances folding around her like smoke. Mothers tugged children close, men paused mid-sentence, and the barkeep's eyes flickered with something unreadable. She met their looks with a calm that was not quite peace, but a line drawn in the dust that no one was to cross. Days passed in a steady cadence of survival. She learned to read the town's hidden currents, the grudges held beneath forced smiles, the quiet alliances forged over shared hardship. The baby grew, its small fists curling and uncurling with a fierce stubbornness that echoed her own. Judd was there, a steady presence in the background, never intrusive but always nearby. He brought news from the surrounding plains, warnings of rustlers and storms, and sometimes a slow smile that made the corners of his eyes crease. She found in him a kind of steady air, like the calm before a long, hard winter. One afternoon, as the sun burned low and gold, a rider came to the edge of town. His coat was worn and dusty, his hat pulled low, but the Colt at his side was unmistakable. He carried a reputation that stirred unease, a man who walked the line between justice and vengeance. The woman watched from the shade of a cottonwood, her baby asleep against her chest. The rider's gaze met hers for a moment, sharp and unyielding. There was a question in his eyes, something that spoke of old debts and unfinished business. That night, as the wind whispered through the creaking shutters, the past began to close in. Shadows moved through the town, voices low and threatening. She could feel the weight of history pressing down, the echo of a life she had fled but could never fully leave behind. Judd came to her door, his face etched with worry. "They're looking for you," he said quietly, "for the child." She nodded, the Colt resting heavy at her side. "Then I'll make sure they don't find her." The baby stirred, small fingers curling tight around the edge of the quilt. In the dim light, she traced the line of its cheek, the fragile life that had brought her back from the edge. The storm was coming, not the one that washes clean the earth, but the one that breaks and bends and tests the roots beneath the surface. She would stand against it, with the child beside her and the Colt ready in her hand, because running had ended. Now, the fight for their future was just beginning. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the soft breathing of the child nestled against her. Outside, the town held its own breath, waiting. Somewhere beyond the edge of light, danger coiled like a rattlesnake ready to strike. She moved quietly, the Colt a familiar weight against her hip. Judd followed at a respectful distance, the unspoken understanding between them a thin thread woven of necessity and something softer, perhaps trust. The townsfolk shuttered windows and drew curtains, their eyes flickering nervously toward the darkening horizon. Rumors had a way of sharpening like knives here, and the promise of violence hung thick in the air. The rider who had come days before lingered too, his presence a shadow on the edges of every gathering. He was a man carved from silence and steel, a stranger who knew too much or perhaps not enough. There was a line in his gaze she couldn't read, a story tangled with her own, waiting to unravel. That night the sound of horses' hooves thudded low against the dirt road, a small band riding slow, deliberate. They stopped just beyond the flickering lanterns, faces hidden beneath hats tipped low, hands resting on weapons. The town's pulse quickened, held hostage by uncertainty. She stepped forward, the baby cradled close, the Colt steady at her side. There was no room for fear. The man with the worn coat and cold eyes dismounted first, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "We're looking for a woman," he said, voice flat as the dry earth beneath them. "And the child she carries." Her hand tightened around the baby, her voice low but unwavering. "She's here." "But you won't take her." The standoff stretched between them, taut as a wire. Judd's shadow fell beside her, a silent promise of protection. The rider's eyes flickered, something like respect or perhaps recognition. Words came then, slow and deliberate, unraveling secrets long buried. The rider spoke of debts and betrayals, of promises broken and lives tangled in a web of violence. The woman listened, each revelation a stone added to the weight she carried, but she did not waver. The Colt gleamed under the moonlight, a beacon of defiance. She was no longer the woman who had run out with a baby in her belly. She was the mother who would fight with every breath, every heartbeat, every ounce of fierce love that surged beneath her skin. The night stretched on, the wind carrying the scent of dust and rain and the sharp promise of reckoning. Whatever came next, she was ready. The Colt was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of the quiet strength that had brought her back and the fire that would keep her standing. The first shots would soon echo through the night, but in that moment, beneath a sky swollen with stars, she held the child tight and met the darkness without flinching. The story was far from over. It was only just beginning to roar. The night breathed with tension, thick and electric, as the quiet town braced against the coming storm. The air tasted of dust and sweat, of old wounds left to fester beneath the surface. She stood firm, the child pressed close to her chest, the Colt resting steady at her side, an extension of her will, a promise etched in steel. The riders circled, slow and deliberate, their shadows stretching long beneath the flickering gas lamps. The man with the worn coat, the one who had come with the weight of old debts, watched her with eyes that saw too much and yet not enough. There was history tangled between them, threads of a past she had tried to bury, now threatening to unravel in the harsh light of survival. Judd remained close, silent but unyielding, a steady anchor in the storm's eye. He had never asked about the pain in her past, only met it with quiet respect, and now that respect was a shield she leaned against. The first crack of a gunshot shattered the stillness, sharp and sudden. Time folded inward, the world narrowing to the space between breath and bullet. She moved without hesitation, the Colt rising, the baby's small cry lost beneath the roar. Shots rang out, echoing against wooden walls and dirt streets. The air thickened with smoke and dust, the night alive with the desperate dance of survival. She fought not just with the weapon in her hand, but with every ounce of fierce love that burned beneath her skin. Her aim was sure, each shot a measured promise that no one would take what was hers. The riders faltered, surprised by the fire they had met, a woman who carried life within her and death at her hip. The baby whimpered, a fragile sound carried on the wind, and she pressed it closer, a living heart beating against her own. When the last shot fell silent, the riders lay broken and scattered, shadows retreating into the darkness beyond the town's edge. She stood tall, breath ragged but unbroken, the Colt warm and steady at her side. Judd approached slowly, his eyes searching hers for a sign, something beyond the violence, beyond the fear. She met his gaze, the child cradled between them like a fragile spark in the dark. "We're not safe yet," he said quietly, "but you made them remember. That's a start." She nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle deep. The fight was far from over, but she had carved a space where hope could grow, a space defended by fire and mercy both. The dawn came slow, bleeding soft light across the scorched earth and broken dreams. She held the baby close, the Colt at her side, and stepped forward into the fragile promise of a new day. The journey was not yet done, but she had returned, not just with the child in her arms, but with a spirit forged in the quiet flames of survival. The story still stretched wide before her, open and unwritten, waiting for the next step to be taken with steady hands and a heart unyielding. The morning light sifted through the dusty window panes, soft and reluctant, as if the day itself was unsure what had passed beneath the night's shadow. She sat on the porch of a weathered cabin, the child nestled in her lap, eyes wide and curious beneath lashes still damp from sleep. The Colt lay beside her, a silent sentinel against a world that had not yet learned mercy. Judd moved about the small kitchen, the scrape of a metal pan and the soft hiss of water on the stove filling the quiet. There was a stillness between them, fragile and new, like the fragile shoots pushing through cracked earth after a long drought. She traced a finger along the baby's cheek, marveling at the softness, the life she had fought so hard to protect. It was strange, this feeling, both tender and fierce, a tether that pulled her away from the shadows that had once threatened to consume her. The town had shifted, the edges softened by the reckoning of that night. People looked at her differently now, not with suspicion or fear, but with a kind of tentative respect. She had become more than a whispered story or a shadow in the doorway. She was a woman who had returned with a child at her side and a Colt on her hip, a living testament to survival and quiet strength. Judd joined her on the porch, handing her a cup of coffee, the warmth seeping into her hands. Their eyes met, no promises made, no words needed, just the steady understanding that comes from shared battles and the slow unraveling of guarded hearts. The land stretched out before them, endless and uncertain, but now it held a different meaning. It was not just a place to run from, but a place to stand, to build, to heal. The baby cooed softly, a small sound full of possibility. She whispered a name then, one she had chosen in the quiet moments between fear and hope. A name to carry the weight of the past, but also the light of what might come. The Colt gleamed in the morning sun, not just a weapon but a symbol, a reminder of the fire that had brought her back and the fierce love that would carry her forward. She stood slowly, the child cradled close, and looked toward the horizon where sky met earth in a trembling line. The road ahead was still long, full of trials and unknowns, but she was no longer running. She was home. And whatever the future held, she would meet it with open hands, steady breath, and a heart that had been tempered by mercy and survival alike. The story had found its quiet place to rest, for now.